A couple of weeks ago, on First Friday, Father Jim celebrated with some degree of solemnity, you might recall, the votive Mass of the Sacred Heart, and described in his homily that Jesuits in general, and he in particular, have a very deep and abiding devotion to the Sacred Heart, and tried very hard to share that love and devotion with us. Today, we kind of attribute the birth and the spread of devotion to the Sacred Heart to the visionary, St. Margaret Mary Alacoque. She lived about a little more than 100 years after St. Teresa of Avila, whom we celebrated yesterday. St. Teresa of Avila, as we heard yesterday, concentrated on love being the motivation of all that we do. That we cannot simply escape from the world and think that we are living a life of love, but rather we have to withdraw in order to be re-empowered with love to go forth and serve one another by showing and spreading the love that Jesus, that God through Jesus really has shown to us. 100 years later, in France, things were a little bit different. And St. Margaret Mary received these visions which really kind of disturbed her, and when she talked about them, they brought on the ridicule of her fellow sisters. She had a very wise spiritual director who was canonized not too long ago, 1992, Saint Claude de la Combière. And he was Jesuit, and he had inherited from ages past. The devotion to the Sacred Heart was not a new thing at that time, but rather it had been developed over a couple of 100 years before. But he saw in the visions of St. Margaret Mary the call to propagate, to spread this devotion to the Sacred Heart. So between the two of them, being affirmed by St. Claude, St. Margaret Mary wrote extensively about the visions, and so did St. Claude Colombier, who, as I mentioned, was a Jesuit. It's very interesting that one of our local Jesuits, Father John Houle, H-O-U-L-E, whom some here may remember, he was a Jesuit missionary in China, served in, was imprisoned for a number of years under Mao Zedong. A miraculous healing, a cure that was given to him under the patronage, under the intercession of Claude de Combière, was the final miracle that allowed the Vatican and Pope John Paul II to canonize St. Claude. And Father Frank Parrish, who is also well known here in Los Angeles as the director of the Apostleship of Prayer at that time, had a strong devotion to St. Claude as well as to the Sacred Heart. So what we have, we've got a very local, homegrown saint here in St. Claude, and through him we know of St. Margaret Mary, whom we celebrate today. So it's kind of like we've got a big family relationship here that in some ways touches our own lives here in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. Father Houle was dying at Santa Teresita in Duarte under the care of the Carmelite sisters when his cure, which all of his doctors said, this can't happen. He was going to be dead in 3 days, and suddenly, within a day, he is back eating pizza. So that was a pretty striking healing there. through the intercession of St. Cloud. So what we have here really is a family relationships, really. Sanctity comes not just from individual effort, but by our communicating the love of Christ with one another. Now, the Sacred Heart, in modern times, and by modern times I mean the last 500-600 years, not the last 2 years. In modern times, the Sacred Heart has addressed two very different types of heresies in the Church. One was what was called Quietism, which basically says, it's just what's inside that counts. Let God take care of it all, and I'll go about my own business because God is going to save me. And basically, the devotion to the Sacred Heart that St. Margaret Mary and St. Cloud promoted was, no, you are recipients of the love of Jesus as he pours his heart out to you, but you must in turn pour your heart out to others in love, in acts of charity. The other heresy, on exactly the opposite, would be Jansenism, which basically concentrated, like the Pharisees here, concentrated on external observance. You were saved only if you rigorously adhered to all of the very narrow and legalistic teachings of this group of teachers, the Jansenists. So the two sides of excessive legalism and excessive laissez-faire spirituality were both addressed by this concentration on the human heart of Jesus as being the fountain of love. Just as our experience, when we symbolize love, what do? We have the heart. Like that, I guess they say now. That symbolizes love. Well, the human heart of Jesus is the vessel of divine love. And he expects our heart to be filled with his love and then to become so filled that it's overflowing in love to one another. The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. After Jesus had spoken, a Pharisee invited him to dine at his home. He entered and reclined at table to eat. The Pharisee was amazed to see that he did not observe the prescribed washing before the meal. The Lord said to him, "O you Pharisees, although you cleanse the outside of the cup and the dish, inside you are filled with plunder and evil. You fools! Did not the maker of the outside also make the inside? But as to what is within, give alms, and behold, everything will be clean for you." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
A reading from the letter of St. Paul to the Galatians. Brothers and sisters, for freedom Christ set us free. So stand firm and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery. It is I, Paul, who am telling you that if you have yourselves circumcised, Christ will be of no benefit to you. Once again, I declare to every man who has himself circumcised that he is bound to observe the entire law. You are separated from Christ, you who are trying to be justified by law. You have fallen from grace. For through the Spirit By faith, we await the hope of righteousness. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything, but only faith working through love. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.